name's Jim Walford. I'm the son of A.B. Walford, and I'm wearing stoles that were given to my brother-in-law, Carl Lindell, and these are the old-style stoles. Kind of wanted to wear the pressfrock, which is consistent with what was worn when Dad was here as pastor during the war, but I couldn't quite fit into those, so these are at least some of the more similar style stoles, and they do have a family connection with the Walford family. So, that's just a little bit of personal stuff. I was 8 months old when we left here. So most of my memories are things that have been told to me or that have been recounted over the years. Some of them are things that I remember as a boy coming back for visits. But from now on, when I say I, it's going to be first person A.B. Walford. So that's who's talking now, A.B. Walford. How many of you remember the 1940s? There's every group, there's been several that have remembered them. When I was born in 1907, horses were everywhere and cars almost nowhere. The world was changing rapidly. Well, I came to serve as pastor at Elim Lutheran Church from 1940 to 46, a time that many refer to as the war years. More on that in a minute. But there is something which you may have already experienced. As the years accumulate, you realize there was a time in your life when your powers were at their peak and when the events around you were at their most intense. Later on, these are often referred to as the good old days. The really strange thing about that is that at the time that you're going through it, those are often very hectic days, and in fact, hard times or uncertain. And that's exactly what it was like in 1940. Things were very uncertain. We moved to Scandia with our daughters, age 5 or under. World events were dark and foreboding. You may be thinking, the United States is a great country and won the war. But that, of course, is because you now know how things turned out. We didn't know what to expect then. 2 more children were born while we were here. We worked hard and raised a family, brought the gospel with all its hopes and comforts to the community, and worked for good in all things according to God's purpose in Jesus Christ. We came to love and cherish the people of Scandia and all its surroundings. I'm told that people remember the energy that I brought to the office of pastor. Recently, the gospel has been described as energy for life, but by providence, nature also gave me a lot of physical energy. I was born on a farm just north of Walnut Grove, Minnesota, through which ran Plum Creek. Yes, the same Plum Creek written about by Laura Ingalls Wilder. The site where the Ingalls had their sod home was on the next farm south. I was expected by my father, Carl Johnson, to take up farm chores as soon as I could do them. That was very young. All the work was done by human and real horsepower. It was the beginning of a transition in time from when things were done by human power or animal-drawn implements to a time where things were done by petroleum power and electricity. By the mid-1950s, I took my son and some of his friends on a visit to John Edstrom by Big Lake, and John hooked up some horses to a wagon, a hay wagon, and took the boys out fishing, ice fishing it was, had to have hard water to take the hay rack out on the lake, and took them out fishing on Big Lake. But that was about the last of that horse-drawn implement era. He was proud of those horses and liked to have them. But after that, pretty much there was a lot of mechanical things, a lot of machinery, most of it noisy and painted red or green or orange. Well, I liked farming, and at first I very fully intended to take it up as my life work. After finishing high school, I farmed in a partnership with my cousin for 3 years. The implements were all horse-drawn, and to learn more about horses, I took a correspondence course in horsemanship and earned the degree Professor of Horsemanship. You laugh. But I couldn't just Google the answers at that time, whatever that is. Later, while pastor at Elim, I would often join in farm work when I was out calling. I've been told that surprised people, and yet was greatly appreciated by the farm families I was visiting. Speaking of cousins and family, after the very first immigrants got here, almost all of those who came after them arrived at a certain place because of relatives or friends living there already. It's amazing how interconnected some communities became and how closely all worked together for the common good. Scandia is one of those places. Elim needed a parish secretary and needed an organist. And I had a cousin who was very good with language and music, so I recommended her to the board. Shortly after my cousin Esther arrived, Vernon Morrison called her up and asked if she would like to go fishing. He caught her. And most of you know the Morrison family, since she lived out her life in Scandia and raised 3 kids, Linda, John, and Kathy. Her descendants are found in the Morrison, Nicholson, and Jamelka families. Esther's good work made it possible to begin publishing the Elim Messenger, which continues to this day. Farming was good for me, but those who are paying attention know that God's purpose is often worked out through a mother's willpower. My mother always put Bible reading and prayers first. Looking back, I'm sure she really wanted me to become a pastor and encouraged it in every way possible. So first I enrolled in Gustavus Adolphus College, from which I graduated with a BA in English. My father encouraged me to come home, as I'd done often on the summers, and help on the farm. And he expected that my other plans would accommodate my continuing to do so. But I was offered a job as a student pastor at Rock Creek, and I spent a year there before enrolling in seminary. After completing Augustana Seminary, I served parishes in Home City and Anoka, Minnesota, before being called to Elim in Scandia. The early settlers in Walnut Grove had established a Swedish language school in the country, so I learned Swedish as a boy. Most of the Augustana Lutheran churches expected their pastors to preach and to lead services in Swedish. By the time I was serving Elim, young people were no longer learning Swedish in school, and in most homes, English, the language of the land, was being used. We adapted so that the young people would feel more at home in church by worshiping in English 3 Sundays a month and Swedish once a month. At those services, I've been told that people say my voice could be heard clearly when I was preaching, even in a day when often there were no microphones or amplification. My son Jim claims he could hear my voice on a videotape of a film made by Swedish actress Ingrid Bergman to the early morning Swedish Christmas Julotta service. This visit was arranged and filmed by the Office of War Information in 1942 to help counteract Nazi propaganda about the treatment of Swedish immigrants in the U.S. It is a beautiful witness of the people of God in church celebrating Christ's birth. The visit was photographed by Look magazine, and a copy is in the Gammal Gordon Museum collection. What my daughter Lois remembers most about the visit was when Miss Bergman visited our home. She took off her boots so as to not track in snow or wet into the house. Lois was impressed by that politeness, but also by her red woolen socks. We sat with her by the fireplace in the parsonage, where we held daily family devotions. Ingrid held daughter Hope in her lap for photos until Hope began to fuss, at which Miss Bergman said, "I think the girl wants her mother." And she had enough sense. The photographers wanted this picture to be taken with the young baby almost on her lap. And she realized when the child began to squirm what kids are like, and she didn't go any further with that. She just said, "I think the girl wants to be with her mother." And so the picture that you see in the parish hall showing that event, that's where Hope is sitting, is on her mom's lap. And that's the way that turned out. Well, that visit was well worth remembering, but the living room of the parsonage was visited more than once by young couples who wanted to get married before shipping out to service in the war. Our daughters, Faith, Lois, and Ruth, were curious about these weddings and crept down the stairwell just close enough so that they could listen and peek at the proceedings without being discovered. And it turns out that Peterson, the first name I'm missing the first name right now, but just after one of these sessions, she came forward here, and she's a Rydeen. You might know who I'm talking about. She actually was a flower girl for one of those weddings in the parsonage, and she remembered being called to do that. The war affected our lives in many other ways as well, but most of all by how completely everybody in the country was involved. After Pearl Harbor, I asked the bishop about enlisting as a chaplain. He said at the time they were gaining many volunteers, so much that he was afraid there wouldn't be enough pastors to serve at home. It turned out over time that there were several pastoral vacancies in the surrounding towns, and I would often have to conduct services for our neighbors at Taylor's Falls and Marine. Often I would leave during the last hymn at Elim and drive to these services. In those days, the Parmalee home in Chisago City had a farm that helped provide food and milk for the residents. I was involved in fundraising when a new barn was needed. As I was visiting residents of the home who were Elim members, Faith would come along and visit others along the hall that I didn't visit. Little did I know that I would later become a resident there. At the time, I was just grateful that so many pitched in to help meet a need for elderly housing. Speaking of milk, some of you may remember oleomargarine. It was a substitute for butter. There was a white sack and a yellow sack with a little bubble to pop so that the yellow would squirt into the white and you'd have to knead them together and make something that was supposed to look like butter. Didn't really taste like butter, did it? No. Ed Weber lived across the road from us. He and I each bought a cow. We housed them on Henry Johnson's property behind the old telephone office. Because I had evening meetings, I milked them in the morning and Ed milked them in the evening. They provided enough for our families to have real milk and butter and some to spare. In 1946, I was called to serve Zion in Gaurawa, and then in 1951, I was called to Calvary Lutheran in Minneapolis. My Scania memories and friendships kept tugging at me. In the little spare time I had at Elim, I liked to go fishing on Big Marine Lake. In 1955, Ernie Anderson was going to sell some pasture land bordering on the lakefront. He asked me to take a look if there was a lot that might interest me, and so I bought one. A couple of years before, I had turned a utility trailer into a travel trailer so that my family and I could travel. It was part of what was going on in the 1950s, and we wanted to see the American West, and it was the beginning of road trips. At first, that trailer was our lake home. Over the next few years, one thing at a time, I built a basement, and then an upper level, and in time, an extension on one end, and then by the time that it got near to my retirement, finished off the upstairs. So in just the last year before I retired. Then Lydia and I came back to Scandia and lived here until going to Point Pleasant and the Parmalee home in Chisago City. Our final earthly resting place is across the road in Elim Cemetary. We passed on in a sure and certain hope of resurrection to eternal life in Jesus Christ. Thanks to all of you for being here.
Come in. I just took a few loaves of rye bread out of the oven. I don't know if it turned out so good this time, but we'll make do. You are all just in time for afternoon coffee. I need to get some cheese and rusks to the table and we'll be all set. Dwight and the Threshers will be in any minute and we'll have a hungry crew at the table this afternoon. Did you see those goofy kids out on the lawn on your way in? My nieces and nephews are here today, and along with my four, Dennis, Deanna, Danny, and Debbie, They were all underfoot while I was trying to get my ironing done, and I love ironing. So satisfying to get all the wrinkles out. Anyway, they come traipsing through in their muddy shoes. Ishinamai! So I gave them a salt shaker, sent them outside, and told them to take turns. Whoever pours salt on a rabbit's tail first gets to take him home. They've been out there for pretty near an hour, and my, they are fun to watch. I am so glad that my kids are such great friends with their cousins. My family, or Select, was my world growing up. I grew up just a few miles down the road on a farm. My grandfather lived in a little house on the end of the street, and my 4 older brothers took turns bringing him his meals every day. My happiest memories were of sitting around the piano with my sisters, Myrna, Marion, and Edith, singing and playing the piano. My cousin Hannah lived on the farm next door, and she was an only child, so she escaped to our house all the time. And when I was a teenager, my brother's daughter Barbie visited from Minneapolis frequently for long visits, and we all just mothered her. It was really important to my parents that we all grow and learn outside of our farm and our family. They made sure that each of us girls went to high school. I went down to Stillwater and worked for my board and room. I walked up and down those hills so many times, back and forth between my school and my duties. When I returned here to Scandia after I graduated, right at the beginning of the Great Depression. I did whatever work I could, mostly housekeeping. And in October 1941, right before Pearl Harbor, Dwight and I got married. His sister said, "What do you think about these kids getting married?" I was 26 and Dwight was 29. Dwight and I work really well as a team. We work together to run this farm. A while back, I was too sick to get out of bed, and there was canning to be done. So he came into the bedroom and he said, "Tell me how to can, because you can't." To be honest, I am a little embarrassed to be here today. You are meeting some true saints on this tour. Pastor Walfred officiated at our wedding, and he's been such a wonderful member of this community for so many years. I'm not as brave as Floyd and Harry or as talented as Wayne. They say I'm being honored as a welcomer of others. Well, I suppose I do go out of my way to introduce myself to people I don't know. And once I meet someone, I never forget a face. But to be honest, it's purely for me. I love meeting new people. They're so interesting. And around here, everyone is from somewhere else. My mother, Ida, traveled here from Sweden when she was 9, and she feels so fortunate to have found Minnesota and this community. When I was a kid, we had a neighbor who complained that there were too many people in the community. We had to stop letting people in. Dad just laughed and said, "We let you in, didn't we?" And I would argue that this community is better for it. I think that the best thing I can do to welcome others and to bring people together is to share my music. I love to play the piano. Hum me a tune and I can play it for you, although I cannot play by note very well. My sisters and I have sung and played at more worship services, funerals, and weddings than I can count. What an honor to be part of so many sacred moments and to meet so many wonderful people in the process. Speaking of, I hope you'll all come to church very soon. And if you do, you have to sit on the right side of the church, opposite the pulpit. That's where all the Big Lake folks sit, and we have to stick together. Now make sure you get enough to eat and take seconds. I don't want you to say like you did last time, that you didn't get enough.
Good afternoon, I'm Nathan Lindgren.
And I'm Selma Lindgren.
We were both born and raised here in Scandia. Met here at the church. We have a dairy farm just down the road by Sand Lake. Depending on the time of year, I've got between 20 and 25 cows that I milk, maybe 100 chickens. We have a few pigs, and every fall we butcher a pig, and that lasts us all winter. We use the whole pig, everything but the squeal.
So they say.
I farm with my brother Maynard. We bought a tractor together, and we do quite a bit of work together actually. He lives about a mile down the road from us, and we find that it goes better working together, two of us, than just individually, so we enjoy it.
And we raised 4 children on the farm. The oldest is Harvey, then Nathalie, and the twins, Dean and Diane. The youngest 2 were born at the height of the Great Depression. It was January 1936. Everybody was very poor then, and that winter was very cold too. So there's a little bit of a story. I was supposed to give birth at the hospital in St. Paul, but there was a snowstorm. It was January. The cars were nothing like they are today, not as reliable, and the roads were also not as good as they are today. So going to St. Paul was like going 100 miles, you know. We ended up making it to a maternity home in Forest Lake, and thank goodness we made it that far.
We did make it to Forest Lake. Yeah, well, you know, times were tough during the Depression, and I and many others who had money in the Scandia Bank, well, we lost everything. I had to sell my very best dairy cow. People wouldn't have it any other way. They had to have your best cow. And I sold it for $11. I suppose that'd be about $200 today, maybe. But I did give every one of my kids a silver dollar when they were young. And when I was handing my youngest daughter her silver dollar, she happened to ask me what I had done with my silver dollar, because my father gave me a silver dollar when I was young. Well, I had to tell her that I had to use that silver dollar during the Depression because we needed medicine for my son Harvey.
Times were very hard then. We did manage to feed the family through the Great Depression and then through World War II when everything was rationed, which was, you know, just kind of a different kind of hardship. We never did go hungry though. We always had food from the farm. You know, there was milk, butter, eggs. We had meat. As Nathan was telling you, we raised some of our own meat. Vegetables. I had a little kitchen garden. So we just kind of survived, and you know, it was very austere compared to today. You never threw anything away. Save up all your old buttons and the reel for your thread, and you might need those things to repair something down the road. Entertainment was also different. It was going to church and social functions through the church, dinner with neighbors or family, playing softball. Anything else we did really for
You
fun?
patched a lot of clothes.
It was very handy with the needle and thread.
Might
Yeah.
not have been fun, but you patched
That's
the
what
clothes.
I did. Yeah, I spent some of my time doing that.
Darn socks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had to ration during World War II and conserve during the Depression, and not only that though. During World War II, we had to make sure the lights were out at night. We had blackout conditions. So one of my jobs was to go around the neighborhood and make sure that nobody had their lights on.
Driving around without your headlights.
Yeah. Driving around without headlights at night, yeah. And so I had to make sure they had blackout curtains or that you couldn't see any light in the neighborhood. So we did that during the war. But once we had Victory over Japan Day, that was a big day. I let my 3 youngest children, Nathalie, Dean, and Diane, go to Hay Lake School and ring the school bell.
That was a good day, and you know, as time went on, at least for our family and for many families, things did get better and better. I had done most of my canning on a wood stove until, when do you think we got that electric stove?
Let's see, we got the electricity in 1928 along the telephone, right around there, but then we had the Depression and World War II.
No stove then.
So I suppose it wasn't until about 1950 or so, about the same time we got plumbing,
Yep,
1950.
That sounds right. So I used that. That made some of my job a lot easier. I cooked a lot. Typically 4 meals a day, plus breads, cake, cookies, that kind of thing. and then canning all throughout the year, whatever was in season. So the girls would pick fruits in the summer, and they would also help cook for the Midsummer Festival. They sometimes helped me cook for when the creamery board met or when the store board met. We would cook for those functions. And yeah, a lot of canning and feeding the men who helped with the harvest. They would butcher many, many chickens in the fall, and we would can a lot of those. It always came in handy to have some canned chicken. Harvey had a habit of rolling in right at mealtime long after he left home. And Dean, another time, brought his whole football team to our house right at dinner. So, it wasn't that hard. I opened a few cans of chicken and vegetables and made dinner bigger, and he loved it. He talked about that for decades to come. And that was, part of looking back on it now, part of the fun of being a mother of farm kids.
You did a good job, Ma.
Thank you, yeah.
Yeah, taking care of family and friends and following the word of the Lord.
We were very blessed.
Yes, we were.
All right. See ya.
Howdy. Well, I feel like I'm right back in my classroom. Are you wondering what you're going to learn today? Oh, I guess you wanted to learn about me. Well, there was the fact that I grew up right here in Scandia on a small farm. My preference was to work outside on the farm. I would help my dad by driving the tractor. Did you know I even drove his brand new tractor all the way from St. Paul to Scandia with my dad following behind in the car? And this was even before I had my license. I loved to drive. It was sad when I had to give it up when I was 84 because of Alzheimer's. I was born March 13th, 1929. I was a lifelong member of Elim, and my grandparents came from Sweden. My parents were John Reuben and Adelia Miller. I had one sister, Dorothy, who was 3.5 years younger. On the farm, my sister and I raised chickens. We raised them from little baby chicks. We would go to the post office to pick them up. They would come in the mail. Let's see. Oh, my love of reading and learning started in a one-room schoolhouse in 1935. The Bone Lake School. We studied the 3 R's, and on cold days we played Monopoly. They said I was quiet in 3rd grade. There were about 16 kids in our class. From there, I went to Chisago City High School, and I graduated in 1947. I don't want to brag, but I was valedictorian of our class. I went on to the Minneapolis School of Business. After that, I became a deaconess in the Augustana Lutheran Church and was known as Sister Jean. Working with children was great. I decided to be a teacher and graduated from the University of Omaha in 1956. There was an article in the paper that said I missed the ceremony where I was to be given an award of magna cum laude for my graduating class. They thought I was playing hooky, but I was already teaching a class. It was so fun. I've always taught 2nd grade for 33 years. I was in Omaha, Nebraska, Virginia, Minnesota, and 3 schools in North St. Paul. I probably had over 600 children, but none of my own. I always remained single. One thing I did then that you can't do now is have prayer in my classroom. Faith was important to me. Later, I got my master's at University of Minnesota Duluth, and I took several other classes over the years. I loved learning. I learned new things like playing the accordion, the organ. There were Swedish classes, Bible study, painting, knitting. I was on the go a lot, but loved meeting new people and having conversation, coffee, laughing, and sweets. I enjoyed the outdoors and travel and photography. Anybody know what this is? With friends, I got to see most of the states and go camping. And we saw the world. There was Australia and New Zealand, riding camels in the Holy Lands, trips to the Orient, Japan, Scandinavia, Europe, and Africa. After the trips, my best friend Alice and I would put on slideshows of our travels to different groups. The money that we made, we donated for a classroom in Africa. My community and following the rules was important to me. I was on the Planning Commission for over 10 years and the Charter Commission in Mounds View, Minnesota. We had many years invested in trying to get a senior living center built. Finally, it happened, and my sister Dorothy was the first one to move into the Bel Ray Senior Living Apartments. Did you know that my sister and I were even the Grand Marshals in a parade in 1998? Well, there was lots of times I would say, if there's a job to be done, a woman is the man to do it. Myself and 3 other single women became known as the Carpenter Ants. That's AUNTS, because we were all ants, or aunts. In 1978, we built our first large redwood deck for myself. It took us 6 weeks. Jeanette and myself were teachers, and so we had the summer off. But Alice and Sharon, who still had their regular jobs, didn't have as much time. We first had to terrace the hill and put in railroad ties. Then we dug and poured cement footings. Alice planned the deck all out on graph paper. It had to be perfect. There was an 8x10 upper deck, an 8x8 octagon lower deck. Those decks were very well made. Over a 20-foot span, it was off only 1/4 of an inch. Perfect. People couldn't believe 4 women did it. It is still standing today. We later built another 16x16 octagon deck and gazebo for Alice. Then there were picnic tables, benches, and other wooden crafts we made. We enjoyed working together. Oh, yeah, there was one thing I never got to learn. I always wanted to be a pilot. Well, I did get to fly in an airplane a lot, and you could say I flew away home to Jesus 3 years ago. Thanks so much for coming to learn about me today. Class is over.
Hi folks, thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it. I guess I'll start right at my beginning. Back in 1937, I was born in Isanti. When I was still very young, my parents and the rest of the family moved to Scandia. We lived in a couple of different houses until I was age 11, and at that point we moved into the house just down past Meister's a few doors, where I wound up living for the rest of my life and raised my family. I had one brother, Dennis, 2 sisters, Carol and Janet, and when we were kids, Dad would take us up to Chisago City to watch softball. That's how I got introduced to it. Scandia formed a team in 1946, but there wasn't a field here at that time, so they played up there. I started playing for Panola when I was 12, and then started playing for Scandia when I was 15. When we weren't playing games, Marlon Thompson and I would play catch for hours in front of his dad's barn. And not many people know this, but when we started out, Marlon had a better rise ball than I did. But I kept working on it, and I got better, and we decided that I should be the pitcher. Well, when we moved to Scandia, Dad worked as a mechanic in the garage across the street, the old bank building. Well, after a little while, he bought the garage at the bottom of the hill, and when I graduated from high school, I went to work for him there. And I was very fortunate to have my dad as a boss, because a lot of times I would leave early to go down to St. Paul and play some softball. So Dad was there to back me up, and anybody else would have fired me because I wasn't going to quit playing softball. Well, 3 years later, 1958, I married my high school sweetheart, Kathy Hirsch. We were just kids. We had 4 daughters, Debbie, Becky, Lynette, and Linda. And they're all unique, all different, but they were also, like all kids, they loved Christmas. And some of my favorite memories are Christmas morning. Even though I told them on a day off I want to sleep in, they would come in very early, of course, wake us up, get us downstairs so they could open the presents. Early on in our marriage, there was one season I played for 5 teams. And Kathy remembers that season very well because every Monday she had to wash 5 uniforms. One of the teams that I played with was an all-black team out of the cities. And I was really glad I chose to do that. It was a unique experience, and I learned a lot. When I look back at some of the photos of our old teams, it's easy to see why we were successful. There was different pieces to the puzzle. Some players were tremendous fielders, some were tremendous hitters, and he brought us all together like the pieces of a puzzle and made a successful team. In our heyday, we would draw hundreds of fans to the games up here, and we'd sell admission 50 cents a carload to get into the ballpark. Usually earlier in that day, we'd have somebody driving around with a car and a loudspeaker to let people know there was going to be a game that night. When we weren't playing in Scandia, we were playing locally somewhere in a tournament. We would range anywhere from Duluth to Rochester to Eau Claire, all over the region, playing a game or playing in a tournament almost every weekend during the summer. We would average about 80 games a year. We won our first state championship in 1963. The next one in 67, in 68, in 69, and again in 71. So it's 5 state championships in 8 years. I retired from softball in 1973. Well, in 1984, I was honored to be elected to the Minnesota State Fast Pitch Hall of Fame. During the ceremony, some numbers that were mentioned were 75 no-hitters and 59 one-hitters. My catcher, Phil Anderson, used to say that he could catch me with a pair of pliers. So I didn't throw as hard as some pitchers did, but I had the knack of making the ball move, and had pretty good control as well. Well, when we got done playing softball, I got interested in other things. Started bowling, golfing, playing cards, hanging out with friends. A typical golf weekend would be 36 or even 72 holes. And one weekend, just to prove that we could do it, we played 100 holes. Remember one Saturday I had the guys over for breakfast before a round of golf. I made them bacon and eggs, and I guess the eggs must have been kind of tough because Phil looked at me and he says, "Erickson, I could walk up to the Merc and back on these eggs and not scuff them." Phil had a way with words. Then in 1984 as well, Bob Meister and I bought Goldwing Aspencade motorcycles. Our dream was to visit all 50 states and all 10 Canadian provinces. We came up short by 2 states and 2 provinces. I've got 1,000 other memories. We could fill a book, but you don't have the time. And just want to leave you with one thought. I didn't last as long as I wanted to, but I can't say that I was cheated. I had a memorable life, met a lot of great people, and I had a family that I was incredibly proud of. Thanks for stopping by.
Before 1952, there wasn't any organized way to fight fires in the Scandia area. The Marine Fire Department, or Forest Lake Fire Department, could be called but they weren't close enough for a quick response, and they had their own areas to cover. Many times when fires occurred, neighbors would get together and do what they could, or the fires just had to burn themselves out. Barn fires often consumed the entire barn and sometimes neighboring buildings. Grass fires could consume cornfields, grain fields, buildings, and other property. People that burned wood for heat in the winter would occasionally have a chimney fire, which would put their house at risk. So in 1952, a small group of local Scandia men decided to form a fire department, of which Harry and I became original members. Soon there was additional local men that joined, and we had a department of 17. Helmer Olson was the first fire chief, and after 10 years of service, I became the second. A used 1947 fire truck was purchased from the North Branch Fire Department. It was a 1.5-ton Ford and only 5 years old. It was a good truck and was current with the times. It had a 250-gallon water tank, but it had a couple shortcomings. One concern was the brakes. Once you got it up to speed, you had to plan ahead when you were going to slow down or stop. The other concern was the siren that was mounted on the front fender. You had to use the siren sparingly, since the siren consumed more power than what the generator could put out, and the battery would go dead.
A garage space was acquired in the township building next to what is now Meister's. The problem with the garage was not long enough to accommodate the fire truck. Fortunately, the back wall could be knocked out and the truck could be backed in. The lower part of the building was the townships where they stored the township motor grader. Huge fire siren was installed on top of the building, and when it blew, it would make you go deaf. Fire department meetings were held in the small room next to the truck. Many times after the meeting, someone would bring a case of beer from the bar next door. It probably helped the meeting attendance. When a fire call was received, we blew the siren, and a telephone call went out consisting of one long ring. This advised firemen that the fire was in progress. We would have to call the operator for details as to where the fire was located.
Harry, you were the driver on the first fire run. That was to the west side of Big Marine Lake. You made it there in 15 minutes or less, and the truck didn't have a whole lot of horsepower. You must have had your right foot almost in the carburetor.
Yes, I did. I liked to get there as fast as I could. I went through stop signs and past cars on the road. That fire call was for a barn fire on the Nordine farm, located on a dirt road called Manning Trail. 6 other firemen from the department joined us for that fire. We were able to save the barn and stop the fire from spreading. We did not have any protective gear, so you would fight the fire with what you were wearing. One time my brothers and their families were over at our house and we received a fire call. I gathered one of my brothers and proceeded to drive to the fire. On the way, my brother kept telling me to slow down and stop for stop signs. I told him that I am on the fire department and I can drive like I was doing.
In addition to the fire department's fleet of 1 truck, we needed a tanker truck to supply additional water. We purchased a used 1958 Chevrolet and we fitted it with a stainless steel 500-gallon tank. The tank was salvaged from a milk truck and was purchased from Big Ed's junkyard. Once the truck was made operational by the firemen, we had a fleet of 2. Most firemen were mechanically inclined and could repair and build just about anything we needed.
In the mid-50s, west of the South Cemetery along 205th Street, a grass fire was burning. Myron Lindgren and his dad saw the smoke beyond the west side of Sand Lake. They went to the fire to help the fire department put out the fire. This fire had spread to a dry wheat field that went up fast. One of the firemen barely made it out of the fire. The fire was stopped before it got to Olinda.
Harry and I were not only firemen, but we were good friends. You and I used to go up to Thistledew Lake up in Itasca County near Togo. We'd drink beer and fish and chew snuff. We had a good time. We were good friends, did a lot of things together. Later on, we became partners in the plumbing and heating business.
After 19 years in the old garage, the fire department was able to move to a new building. In 1971, a 3-stall fire station was built on the location of Helmer Olson's blacksmith shop. Now the Scandia Fire Department had a building that was designed for the department, which could accommodate both trucks and additional equipment. This building allowed for future expansion.
Harry, do you hear that? That's a fire siren. We gotta go.
Thank you.
I was born Peter Magnus Nelson in 1835 in Småland, Sweden. I had heard about America growing up, and by the time I was 30, decided my wanderlust had the best of me and I was going to immigrate to America. Following the typical Swedish migration, I landed in New York, went to Chicago, and meandered west to western Illinois. As the Civil War was going on, work was easy to come by. Most of the able-bodied men were away at war, and I could fit in pretty easy as a farmer. By 1865, the war was winding down, and they were taking recruits for 1 year conscription instead of 3 years, which had been the norm. And I signed up with the 148th Illinois Infantry. Having minimal training, no battle experience, they assigned us to guard duty along the railways of East Central Tennessee. We never did see action, but 3 of our unit were killed by marauding guerrillas and hit-and-run tactics. 1865, the war got over. The need for us on duty was no longer needed, and they mustered us out 5 months early. You went home. The only problem, the other veteran soldiers were coming home, and work became hard to come by. So I went home to Sweden. While there, met a lovely lady, Louisa, and we wed in 1871. 2 years later, a son, Axel, would be born. 3 years after that, a daughter, Josephina. And in 1884, a second daughter, Annie, would be born. But things were getting tough in Sweden. Droughts. Farm became difficult and food shortages became the norm. I decided again to go to America. This time from Chicago I went northwest to Minnesota to a little village called Scandia. I had an opportunity to purchase the priest house, or Elim Lutheran Church, and I bought the house, a large house, perfect for the family. 2 more children would arrive. 1887, Hannah would be born, and in 1889, Isaac. I applied for a veteran's pension and was denied. So we settled into farming for the next 30 years. Axel would work around the farm, work with the farm with me. Josephine got married, moved to Amory, Wisconsin. Hannah and Annie would stick around the farm, but little Isaac, typical of the youngest, wanted to spread his wings. And he went down to St. Paul and became a carpenter. June of 1917, Isaac was drafted. With the Great War going on in Europe, he filed for an exemption, being he was the only income for the family, and he was denied. So he shipped off with the American Expeditionary Force to France and worked in an ammunition supply depot. Armistice Day 1918, the war got over and the troops came home. But Isaac didn't come. He had contracted a disease and was extremely ill. And by December, he would die. They buried him in France. I understood war, I understood disease as I had seen it in the Civil War. We had 70 of our unit die of disease. But when it comes home, it hurts. After many letters to Washington and many months and years of waiting, his remains were disinterred in France and they were sent to Scandia. We had a full military burial, full funeral, huge for a little town like Scandia. And Isaac was home. Having retired from farming, with Josephina and Hannah now married, I left the farm to Axel and Annie, and Louisa and I would move to Amory, Wisconsin and live out our lives with Josephina and her husband. And oh, the fishtails I could tell you of those last few years waiting for the Lord to take me home.